these are the 15 best examples I was given. I haven't hidden any coherent examples just to help make my point. And I have to mention again that these examples are given by people of all races who claim to see racism in their daily lives. Well, I hate to have to be the one to point this out, but all of these examples of this so-called racism that permeates our nation, none of them really amount to anything. Can staring at someone really be compared with persecution? Can being overly friendly to someone really be compared with denying them employment? And when I become aware of disconnects like this, I start to look for others. What other inconsistencies are hiding behind this word, this hammer called racism? If we go back to our conventional wisdom definition of racism, we see that a racist is someone that believes that one race is better than another. What would you say to someone that said blacks are better basketball players than whites on average?
I would say that is true.
Would you agree the NBA is 90% African American?
Yes, I would.
Why is that?
Because they think that we're black, that we're better at athletes and stuff like that.
As it is now, yeah, I would say that black men are better at basketball than white men.
Okay. Because of the results that we see.
Because of the results that we see.
I mean, I would hope, I thought, that if a white person has the skill of a black person, they could be on the basketball team. I'm not that well acquainted with it in terms of the racial, how it's occurred that the racial makeup of basketball teams is as such as it is. I have always believed it probably had to do with their skill at the game.
Well, that wasn't too hard. Most people have no problem with saying that blacks are better at basketball than whites, even though that does fit that common thread among definitions of racism. See the disconnect? So I guess it's okay to say that one race is better at something than another as long as the one race is never white people. And if you think I'm kidding or maybe paranoid, let's see how many people would be willing to state that white people may be just as skillful in other areas as blacks are at basketball. Are black over overrepresented in basketball?
Yeah, I think they are.
Why?
They're probably better players.
Is it safe to say then that the white people might be better at human relations?
No.
Do I think there are areas where white people excel and it's due to their skill and that's why more white people are in those areas? That's a tough one. I think it could be true, but I don't know what the areas would be.
Are white men better at keeping jobs and paying bills than black men? Now that just opens up a whole bag of tricks. That just throws in socioeconomic status, racism, culture, everything.
Now, the point I'm going to notice, Tina, was that when I asked you if black men were better at basketball, you gave me basically a one-word answer with a couple of qualifiers.
Right.
If I asked you if men are better holding down a job, I got 3 paragraphs.
Right.
Can you see maybe a different standard that you assign to blacks versus you assign to the whites?
No.
No?
No.
Even though you gave me a yes, blacks are better because of the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But whites, even though the evidence shows they're better at this, we've got to back up and we've got to really consider this more.
Yeah.
You don't consider that any kind of a double standard at all?
No, I wouldn't call it a double standard at all.
So the conventional wisdom is that it's acceptable to acknowledge the skill and ability of certain races in some areas, but no one can seem to find any areas where white people demonstrate their skill and ability. It's another one of those disconnects. I mean, who can deny it? In areas where people of color excel, we credit them for their capabilities. But how do we view areas where whites excel? We condemn them for their racism. This double standard is a clear example of how the conventional wisdom on racism has become itself a form of anti-white bigotry. And I'll demonstrate this by asking about an area where white people do well.
Why is it that Caucasian students test higher on standardized tests than black students?
Well, because the tests are made for them.
The tests are made for the Caucasians?
Oh, yeah. The best thing you can do in school is be white. because that's the easiest way to get through. And primarily, most people who get through school who are white don't ever learn anything. All they do is memorize the answers until they take the test.
I would say who writes the IQ test when thinking about who scores higher. So if you have white people that are writing the tests and creating the scoring for the tests, then of course white people are going to score higher on IQ tests.
I know that there's been evidence that the questions are cultured towards the white, or each question is culturally biased towards the white culture.
Most of the tests are composed and put together by non-African Americans.
Well, first of all, you have to look at who wrote the tests. We don't always know, so there may be cultural bias.
See that? Pick an area where white people outperform others, and the conventional wisdom is that it's not due to their skill, but due to some type of white bias. This is another example of how the conventional wisdom on racism today is actually quite biased against white people. The reason whites perform well on standardized tests is because we cheat. What would you say if I told you that white people write the IQ tests, but Asians always outscore them?
I would find that fascinating, but not, I mean, I guess not necessarily surprising. I think that each culture has its gifts and talents, and taking tests is a certain talent.
I don't believe there's a possibility that our testing results, the grades of our children, has nothing to do with racism. I think that would be naive to say.
But yet, we still can't come up with an explanation of why the culturally biased test designed by whites actually favor Asians.
That's true. I didn't say that there was a method to the madness. I just said there was a madness.
You feel that the bias is toward whites?
Mm-hmm. Towards white culture.
What do you say when people say that these tests that are written by whites, consistently the highest scores are Asians?
I guess I don't know that statistic. My first guess for the reasons why Asians do better, and from what I've studied, that questions tend to be cultured towards the white culture, or bias towards white culture, is that similarities in teaching style. That would be probably my best guess.
But even if there are similarities in teaching styles, wouldn't the whites, they're culturally biased towards the whites, if they were culturally biased towards the whites, wouldn't the whites still be the ones exceeding?
Yeah, if you look at it on face value.
If the tests were made for white people, why is it that Asians outscore whites consistently on standardized tests?
Well, first of all, Asians have 6,000 years of written literate history behind them.
But you said that
No.
tests were made for whites.
Well, they're made for people who think a certain way.
So Asians and whites think a different way than African Americans do, and Latinos?
There are different ways of thinking. Different populations represent those ways of thought and cultural congruences different ways.
I'm trying to get back to my original point. You said that the tests were created for whites. I said that Asians outscore them, and you said the reason why is why?
Well, I don't think we have time to cover that right now.
This is the unchallenged, disconnected outlook that passes for logic in many of the mainstream of our culture today. If you ask today's believers in racism why it is that whites outscore some others on standardized tests, the most common answer will be the cultural bias theory. Now, if you're rude enough to point out that the fact that Asians have been outscoring whites for decades discredits the whole cultural bias theory, well, believers won't be bothered by pesky facts. Ask them again tomorrow the same question about why whites outscore others on standardized tests, and the answer will still be cultural bias. And this illustrates the dogmatic nature of the believers. I just can't accept this logic anymore, so I'm going to ask some more questions about racism. But what I'm looking for are more of these disconnects.